Hello everyone, and thank you for taking time to see my presentation on human trafficking and the North-South gap. Before we get started, I want to tell you a little bit about myself. I'm a U.S. Navy intelligence veteran currently pursuing a master's degree from Michigan State University. I do independent investigations of businesses and groups suspected of engaging in human trafficking. My particular specialty is interfacing between the community and various nonprofits with police departments and other organizations. Now that I have given you some background on myself, let me give you some background on the project. I was challenged by my professor, Dr. Emerson, to come up with a theory and apply it to human trafficking. I had up until that point avoided theory at all costs. I feel that it's too often prevalent in countering human trafficking, especially in organizations. But let that be a lesson. We may not know what happens when an unstoppable force meets an unmovable object, but Dr. Emerson will win in the end. What is the North-South gap? It was proposed by Willy Brandt, a chancellor of West Germany. He chaired a research commission that found there are developmental disparities between what has been termed Global North and Global South. The North is numerically inferior in terms of number of country and by population, so also numerically inferior to Global South. There are constant regime and border changes happening in Global South, lower GDP per capita in the Global South. Looking into this myself, I decided to see where some of the most powerful organizations in the world are located. It was very telling to me that many are in the Global North. The UN, NATO, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, all the members of the G8 and the World Trade Organization are all headquartered in the Global North. Of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, only one is located in Global South, that is China. The European Union is composed of 28 members, only 2 are located in Global South. Please take a look at the lower right corner. Notice how there are more Global North countries ranked very high in human development, and all the countries ranked low are Global South countries. You see that right here? Does it still exist? After all, the concept was created in the 80s, and I learned about it almost 20 years ago. In addition to the above organizational intelligence I also did a publication pool. As you can see, I shamelessly plug Google Scholar, and I do that because even if you're not reading an article, you can do a search and use the date range function. If you are studying a group or movement and there are no publications about it within the last 5 to 10 years, chances are it is no longer relevant. I prefer government publications and think tank releases. I love RAND Corporation documents, and for this project I could utilize those, but I also need to look into professional journals. I show 3 articles that show the North-South gap concept is still very much being used. Krugell looks at the impact of trafficking from Global South countries to other Global South countries and how that relates to children's welfare. When an economic organization is writing recent reports about a concept, you can bet it is still relevant. The report from the National Bureau of Economic Research concerns the effects of colonialism. Half of the Tier 3 countries, that is the worst category for human trafficking, half were colonies. The Tier 3 country that has been out of colonial rule the longest is Syria, having gained independence in 1945. And the youngest to emerge from colonialism is the Tier 3 countries in the north that were part of the USSR until they gained independence in 1991. Some argue the gap is getting wider. It can get wider in terms of a north within the north getting noticeably more prosperous than the southernmost Global North countries. Galbraith uses regression models to show how there's actually an increase in the last few decades of inequality between Global North and Global South. Now that I've explained the North-South gap, I must explain human trafficking. Each year, the Department of State releases the Trafficking in Persons Annual Report. This is the document that defines human trafficking and into what categories countries are assigned. Human trafficking is essentially modern-day slavery. I apologize for so much information on one slide, but definitions are important. According to the Department of State, it comes in 2 forms. First is sex trafficking, in which a commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or in which the person induced to perform such an act has not attained 18 years of age. Or the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for labor or services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of subjection to involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, or slavery. This is called labor trafficking. There may be more slaves now in this century than any other in history, 24.9 million. Krugell again talks about the desperate situation facing Sub-Saharan Africa, where children are trafficked to and from various other countries, often within Sub-Saharan Africa. He estimates 80% of children in that region live in poverty. This must cause enormous strain. There's an article I came across that shows that strain can affect people getting involved with prostitution. Prostitution is a form of sex trafficking depending on how it is being done. Africa is interesting because it and South America are the two continents located completely in the global south. There may be a link between people in desperate circumstances and human trafficking. So what is my hypothesis? That there is a correlation between region and tier. The dependent variable is human trafficking. I was expecting that most of the tier 3 countries would be in global south. For those of you who do not know what a tier is, let me explain. Out of the 186 countries that the Department of State recognizes as countries, 183 are assigned a tier. 3 were not assigned due to insufficient data. The tier represents how countries are in relation to their compliance to a piece of anti-trafficking legislation, specifically the Victims of Trafficking and Violence Protection Act of 2000. Think of it like the Byrne scale. Tier 1 is country fully in compliance. Tier 2 is a bit confusing because there's a subsection of the tier. But Tier 2 means the country is actively trying to comply but still has a problem. There's a subsection called the Tier 2 watch list. For the sake of convenience when it comes to entering data, I have just combined Tier 2 and Tier 2 watch list. Tier 3 countries do not comply with legislation and are not making any effort. The main independent variable is going to be region. So Tier 1, the best tier, 3 the worst. Regions grouped as north or south. I sat down with that picture Willie Brandt drew and using Google Earth and my Zoom feature cataloged which countries were in which region. Other independent variables were GDP per capita. Human development in terms of quality is indexed by the UN. Of course, consider the country an independent variable as well, but is of limited use. You can take a look at country and GDP below. There are so many multiple values of per capita and country, it's hard to get anything meaningful from there. N equals 182 when we're dealing with GDP per capita, because one country was not given a GDP per capita. Remember that only countries that are recognized by the State Department are counted in the National Trafficking in Persons Report. Other countries and agencies recognize some different countries. There are different ways of looking at the world, and the world looks different to others. Elsewhere, you'll notice N equals 183. So my methods were to put my information into a spreadsheet, then use IBM's software package, statistical package for the social sciences, or SPSS. Then I looked at frequencies and crosstabs to determine Pearson correlation and reject the null hypothesis that there is no correlation. Frequencies are great because they show trends rather instantly and are readily understood by most people. Here we see there are more Global South countries than Global North, yet there are twice as many countries located in Global North that are rated Tier 1. See at 22 to 11 right here. More countries in terms of development are rated very high in the region of Global North than in Global South. Yet for those countries rated low, all are in the Global South. Crosstabs. These are necessary to reject the null hypothesis. Why do we need a measure to reject the null? There's a quote I got off of YouTube attributed to a woman named Rosaline Torrey. Man is the master of lying to himself. If your research confirms absolutely what you thought, as a researcher, you need to ask yourself if the results are valid or if you are seeing what you want to see. The very first crosstab we look at is tiered region. This is the foundation of my project. If P is less than 0.05, the null can be rejected. As you can tell by my obnoxious formatting, P is less than 0.05. This is expressed in the chi-square section. The asymptotic significance is less than 0.05. Here we see correlation of development in regions. Sadly, many countries the Department of State recognizes, the United Nations does not. This means that an assumption did not hold. You can see the note beneath the chi-square section. Though the p-value is less than 0.05 is a Pyrrhic victory, perhaps in the future someone will solve this problem. The last thing to look at is GDP per capita. Given that strain might play a part in human trafficking, I was expecting to find a negative correlation. The reason is very simple. The worse off country is, perhaps the higher its tier number. Remember, tier 3 is the worst category in terms of human trafficking. So as the per capita goes down, tier goes up is what we would expect. And that does manifest itself. There is a negative correlation. Note, again, N is going to equal 182. One country was not cataloged by Forbes. It was not given a GDP per capita. Here is the list of my references. They will be in a description if I can put them there. I feel that some of the research I have done has been the best of my life, and I thank all of you who are watching my video or who read my discussion post.